As Hezbollah declares full responsibility for the drone attack on Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's residence and launching a barrage of rockets into Tel Aviv, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken lands in Israel in a bid to revive ceasefires in the region. This is as the U.S. continues to supply billions of dollars in aid and weapons to Israel. What does the U.S. and Israel want at this point in the conflict? Is there a real will to end the violence in the region, or is this just another round of negotiations for the news cycle? So the real question here is, what will be the fate of the region after the 11th round of talks involving Blinken? Welcome to In Depth. In an official statement, Hezbollah's media relations office chief, Mohammed Afif, claimed responsibility for a last week drone targeting Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's residence. The Times of Israel highlighted Hezbollah's recent announcement amid recent escalations along the Israeli-Lebanese border. According to the newspaper, Hezbollah declares its full, complete and exclusive responsibility for the Caesarea operation targeting Netanyahu. Israel has also signaled its expected retaliation for Iran's missile barrage and could be widened as a result of the drone strike. Delving more into this, we're joined now from Beirut by Marcel Balougi, a military and strategic expert. Thank you, sir, for joining us. Firstly, can you tell us a bit about Blinken's visit to Israel and coinciding with Hezbollah's declaration of responsibility for the drone attacks on Netanyahu's residence? How could that affect the ceasefire talks that Blinken is participating in right now?
Can you repeat the question, please? Because
yes, sure. I'm talking about Blinken's visit. It comes at the same time as Hezbollah declared responsibility for the drone attacks on Netanyahu's residence. How do you think this could affect ceasefire talks and Blinken's visit when it comes to participating in it right now?
First, good day to you and to your audience. The negotiations are deemed to fail since they started because of the Lebanese rejection on the amendment of 1701. 1701 is totally rejected by Israel, but the new amendments include 13 articles or 13 items. The first one is related to the Lebanese sovereignty. The first one is on the supervision on the sea. This is totally rejected. It's prohibited because all the operations should take place through the Lebanese army. There's also another item that says there should be an air supervision in the Lebanese sky to handle the dangerous targets which affects the Lebanese sovereignty. So if the agreement fails regarding the ceasefire or the implementation of 1701, the battlefield is the one that would decide. And now it's clear that the air invasion is still violent. Even after yesterday's negotiation, there are lots of big goals in Lebanon that are being targeted, especially the infrastructure of Hezbollah. The fighting is continuous and it increases. Hezbollah also increased its missiles against the occupied Palestinian territories. Hence, the battles are getting more violent and there's nothing in the horizon regarding the ceasefire. So there is a tendency for violent escalation.
Which kind of, sir, brings me to the next idea here. Since you talked about the escalations in general, we've seen in the last few weeks and maybe days an increase, and a tremendous increase when it comes to escalations, where the Israelis are targeting, bombarding much of South Beirut, in addition to the south of Lebanon generally, and Hezbollah responding back. Do you think these escalations mean that a ceasefire is something that is not attainable at this point in time? that either side are not interested in actually negotiating a ceasefire?
The targets are still far away. Ceasefire would never happen now. It was announced today by Netanyahu. He announced that there will be no ceasefire as long as our targets are not achieved and the residents of northern Israel are not in peace. Hence, Hezbollah missiles are still targeted towards Israel, and now there are lots of displaced people. So, Hezbollah's missiles are still increasing. So security in northern Israel will never be achieved. Of course, there will be no ceasefire. This is confirmed until the northern of Israel is secured, and Hezbollah is insisting on 1701 without any amendment. So the escalation is coming. The battlefield is the one that will decide the agreements, which is so early now.
Okay, but also the U.S. Special Envoy to Lebanon, Amos Hochstein, arrived in Beirut yesterday in the latest efforts to achieve a ceasefire. And the UN he said that the UN resolutions are the basis for a ceasefire in Lebanon. How does that fit into the ceasefire bid of Blinken? It's known that his visit yesterday was mainly folklore. 1701 as it is, and Israel and Netanyahu are insisting on the amendment of 1701, and both parties' goals are not achieved yet. So the visit of Blinken or Hochstein or whoever, they are here for two main reasons, which is before the American elections, and if they manage to achieve a ceasefire, he improves Harris's chances in winning the US elections because Trump is advancing her. In addition, another main goal for this visit is to separate the arenas. Maybe after the killing of Sinwar, they try to separate the Lebanese front from the Gaza front, which has not been achieved. That's why it's a failure, because it's known that 1701 will not go easy. Well, sir, you brought up the idea of the 1701 resolution in general. So can we discuss this more? The amendments that the Israelis want, do you think this is something that they can attain, or is it something that is, not good for the Lebanese people in general? I'm assuming that the Israelis are trying to pressure changes or amendments because of, the recent strikes where they've hit several, leaders in Hezbollah and managed to assassinate them. Can they pressure the Hezbollah side to back down, and is it something that the international community will accept? Please. The amendments are essential. Hezbollah believe that they deserve some things before the battle, and of course they ask that the amendments would not affect the Lebanese sovereignty, and they do not want Israel to increase its control or domination inside Lebanon through international forces because they failed to implement their previous mission in Lebanon. In addition to the most important issue, which is the missiles that Hezbollah owns. These things need a project that is not ready to be implemented. Hezbollah, with its potential, is still ready, and they even drag the Israeli forces inside Lebanon to deter them and achieve the balance of deterring. Because Hezbollah only has the power of deterring, and not today or not tomorrow. Hezbollah will never make any political settlement, so they are waiting
because
Yes.
this is their battlefield.
Okay, unfortunately, sir, I totally understand the point you're trying to make that Hezbollah will not back down and Israel won't back down, but we're out of time for this segment of the episode. So, Mr. Marcel Balougi, a military and strategic expert joining us from Beirut, thank you so much for your insights and thank you for joining us here on Q. With war raging in Gaza and Lebanon, Antony Blinken's visit to the Middle East comes as Israeli military has intensified its aggressions in the past few weeks on both fronts.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is set to make his 11th trip to the Middle East amidst rising tensions in the Gaza Strip. The State Department announced that his week-long visit comes as the situation escalates in the region. Meanwhile, Israel has intensified its aggression in northern Gaza following the assassination of Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar, while showing no signs of easing its military offensives in Lebanon. Additionally, the potential for Israeli retaliation against Iran due to recent missile attacks remains a significant concern. U.S. President Joe Biden recently urged Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to move on from the ongoing war on Gaza, yet Netanyahu has remained committed to continuing military operations. Blinken's visit is anticipated to open discussions on a ceasefire proposal that has been stagnant for months. During his trip, Blinken will meet with Netanyahu and President Isaac Herzog, according to Israeli officials. State Department spokesman Matthew Miller said in a statement that Blinken will discuss the importance of bringing the war in Gaza to an end, securing the release of all detainees while alleviating the suffering of the Palestinian people. He added that Blinken will discuss planning for when the war ends and the need to chart a new path forward that enables Palestinians to rebuild their lives. Furthermore, Blinken will address the rising tensions with Hezbollah in Lebanon, particularly after recent Israeli ground operations that have heightened fears of a broader regional conflict. With tensions running high in the Middle East, will this visit finally pave the way for a lasting ceasefire in the region?
To help us analyze the situation now, we're joined by Hino Klink, a former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense from Washington. Thank you, sir, for joining us.
Good morning.
Good morning to you, sir. Could we start off by asking, given the recent assassination of the Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar, how do you assess the current Israeli government's approach to continuing its military actions versus pursuing diplomatic solutions? Does this indicate that Israel actually is willing to agree to a ceasefire, given what's happening right now in the north of Gaza? It doesn't seem like it's like they're relenting or giving up, the ground operations.
Well, it's my opinion that the elimination of the mastermind of the brutal terrorist attacks of October 7th is not just the ultimate objective that the Israelis have. It is certainly a victory for the Israelis, both operationally, but also psychologically. But I think the Israelis will continue to utilize the momentum they have gained militarily, whether it's against Hamas, Hezbollah, and other Iranian proxies, to continue to push the fight to eliminate any military threats, and particularly with respect to the Hezbollah threat in the north, so that Israelis can move back into their homes after their forced evacuation that's been ongoing for over a year now.
Yes, but I mean, has the military objectives, actually the military ground operations, achieved anything in the last year when it comes to one of their main goals, which is, retrieving back the detainees in Gaza? In fact, military operations have led to the death of several of the Israeli detainees in Gaza.
Well, let's not forget the genesis of the hostage drama, and that is the attack of October 7th, where the Hamas militants, terrorists entered Israel and took these people back to Gaza. So let's not forget that. That is certainly a key
Yes,
and a
but
very important objective of Israel
I
and other
understand
countries.
that
Remember,
the
they're
history of it,
American,
and it's
they're
been a year,
hostile
sir.
as well.
I'm sorry for cutting you off there, but I mean, the point is, the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, is here to negotiate things diplomatically. Wouldn't diplomacy achieve these goals better than, the continuation of, military operations? It's been a year.
I would like to be hopeful, but there are a number of reasons why I don't think that there's going to be a ceasefire in the short run. First of all, as your introduction mentioned, Secretary Blinken has come to the region 11 times now in the last year and has been largely unsuccessful. What successes that have been accomplished through military force. Unfortunately, that has not resulted in Hamas releasing the remaining hostages.
But why
What
would
I'm
they?
hopeful for, if I may just finish, please, what I'm hopeful for is that with the elimination of Sinwar, that a new Hamas leadership will be open to negotiating the release of those hostages as a key tenet of a ceasefire. That's what I'm hopeful for.
Yes,
However, I don't think, frankly, that's going to happen before the American elections that will occur 2 weeks from today.
yes, but I mean, well, okay, let's start. We'll discuss this in a bit. But generally, the situation in Gaza is quite dire. The humanitarian situation in Gaza is quite dire, and the international community in general has said it is quite dire. Is the Secretary of State going to try to negotiate with the Israeli side to allow, humanitarian aid to enter specifically to the north of Gaza that has been completely cut off?
I do believe that Secretary Blinken has as one of his primary objectives additional relief supplies going into various parts of Gaza. And I also think that the Israeli government will probably concede on that point in order to give Secretary Blinken a partial win. But I don't believe that he's going to leave the Middle East with a ceasefire, particularly a lasting ceasefire.
But sir, I mean, well, the north of Gaza has been cut off from aid for almost 3 weeks now. If there was a possibility that, the Israeli side would allow aid to enter north of Gaza, this would have happened already. It could have been a phone call. Blinken didn't actually have to come down to the Middle East to do that.
You're absolutely right. But to be perfectly candid, the Biden administration has lost most of its influence on the Israeli government. And that is for a variety of reasons, including putting what I would offer undue public pressure on the Israelis and giving them military advice that has proven to be inaccurate or wrong. For instance, going into Rafah, we've seen that from a military perspective, from an operational perspective, Israeli ground forces going into Rafah has been very successful, particularly if you think about the fact that that has allowed them to eliminate Sinwar last week.
Okay, well, sir, now that Blinken is doing his 11th round in the region since the war on Gaza started, given that all his previous visits have failed to achieve their intended outcome, what is the difference about this visit? What is Blinken bringing to the table today as opposed to what happened, a year ago?
Well, there's a school of thought here in Washington and in other Western capitals that says that with the elimination of Sinwar, there should be a new opportunity, perhaps, to be able to convince both the Israeli leadership as well as the Hamas leadership to come to the negotiating table. Additionally, with the Israeli strikes in Lebanon, as well as in other places, that Iran may become a little bit more pliable and open to negotiations because, as everyone knows, Israel is planning on striking back at Iran based on their previous.
This isn't good for the entire, the entire region, and for the U.S. as well. It's not something in favor of anyone in the region. How do you think the U.S. could pressure Israel into backing down from, targeting certain areas in Iran, for instance, and expanding the scope of this war?
Well, again, it's my opinion that the Biden administration doesn't have much influence on the Israeli government anymore. It's been very public in terms of trying to convince the Israelis that striking both Iranian nuclear sites as well as oil refinery sites should be off the table. Additionally, there's been a number of executive communications between the U.S. Secretary of State and U.S. Secretary of Defense and their Israeli counterparts that have been released to the public. I believe that those types of leaks are actually counterproductive in trying to shape Israeli actions. So I really question how much influence Washington has on Jerusalem these days.
Well, sir, I mean, you're talking about the idea of, the U.S. Losing sort of influence on Israel, and that they've parted ways, I suppose, in the way they see how things should be done right now in the region. What does Blinken's visit do? I mean, if they no longer see eye to eye on what they think should happen, how can they sort of negotiate amongst themselves, not just, negotiate a ceasefire?
Again, I'm not particularly optimistic. I think the timing is based on both international developments. Again, the situation on the ground, most pointedly, the elimination of Sinwar as potentially offering an opportunity for ceasefire negotiations. Again, that's not my view, but that is a view that's being advocated here in Washington and other Western capitals. But I also believe there's an American domestic component to this, and that is our elections. It would be very helpful if the Biden administration, if the Biden-Harris administration would be able to tout a ceasefire as a foreign policy success, because quite candidly, the Biden-Harris administration just has not had many foreign policy successes.
But don't you think that the Biden administration could have actually pressured Israel into being more serious about negotiating a ceasefire if they had, cut down on supplying arms, for instance, or, supplying, aid as well to Israel? This could have been used, and this has been used in the past when it comes to Israel, not necessarily with the Biden administration, but this could be a tool that could be used by the U.S.
Your statement is an accurate one. That tool has been used before in a variety of administrations over the last many decades.
Yes.
The Biden administration has certainly threatened or implied the possibility of that happening. It has not acted on that. Again, my position is that they should not have used those tools. So this is a case where I actually agree with them. But the fact of the matter is the war is still raging over a year since the terrorist attacks of October 7th. And I do not see Israel's military counteroffensives in trying to eliminate the threat against the Israeli homeland and the Israeli people subsiding in the next several weeks.
Okay, so how does the U.S. Address through this bid for a ceasefire the concerns of American voters regarding its foreign policy in the Middle East? You spoke a bit about, a need for a win when it comes to foreign policy. Do you think that if this round of negotiations is successful, it's important, and it could show that the Americans don't have just unconditional support for Israel, regardless of its benefit or lack of to the U.S.?
Well, let's remember that in the United States, whether it's a Republican administration or a Democratic administration, there's widespread support for Israel, the Israeli people, and then it depends who is in government in Jerusalem, the level of support given there. I do not anticipate, again, particularly right now, since we are in the last moments of the American presidential election, the Biden-Harris team doing anything major, whether it's cutting off military aid or reducing military aid or anything else. I just do not think that is politically feasible in the United States. I think what will be interesting to see is what is the outcome of the United States presidential election, and what does that bode for future negotiations between Washington, Jerusalem, and the other parties? Because I think you'll see a change one way or another, whether it's a Harris administration or a Trump administration. There'll be a change.
I apologize, but I have to cut you off there. I sort of get the gist of it, but we're out of time for this episode of In Depth. So thank you so much, Mr. Qnews, former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. Thank you for your insights. And that brings us to the end of today's episode of In Depth. Stay tuned for more exclusive stories here on Qnews. Thank you for watching.